Chapter 8. A few days after Jim Reed's evening visit to the Deans, two cowboys from the Diamond and half outfit on their way to Cherry Creek stopped at the ranch for dinner. The well-known, open-handed Baldwin's hospitality led many a passing rider thus aside from the main valley road and through the long meadow lane to the cross triangle table. Always there was good food for man and horse, with a bed for those who came late in the day, and always there was a hearty welcome and talk under the walnut trees with the Dean. And in all that broad land there was scarce a cowboy who, when riding the range, would not look out for Dean's cattle with almost the same interest and care that he gave to the animals bearing the brand of his own employer. So it was that these riders from the Tonto Flats country told the Dean that was looking over the cross triangle cattle watering at the tally-ho that they had seen several cases of screwworm. "We doped a few of the worst and branded a calf for ye," said Shorty Myers. And his companion, Bert Wilson, added as though apologizing, "We couldn't stop any longer because we got to make it over to Wheeler's before morning." "Much obliged, boys," returned the Dean, and then with his ever-ready set jest, "Surely you put the right brand on the calf?" "We all aren't riding for no Tally-Holt Mountain outfit this season," retorted Bert dryly as they all laughed at the Dean's question. And at the cowboy's words, Patches, wondering, saw the laughing faces change and look of grim significance flash from man to man. "Anybody see anything over your way lately?" asked the Dean quietly. In the moment of silence that followed, the riders looked questioningly from the face of Patches to the Dean and then to Phil. Phil smiled his endorsement of the stranger, and Shorty said, "We found a couple fresh branded calves which didn't seem to have no mothers last week, and Bud Stillwell says some things look kind of funny over there in the D1 neighborhood." Another significant silence followed. To Patches it seemed as though the brooding hush that often precedes a storm. He had not missed those questioning looks of the visitors, and had seen Phil's smiling endorsement, but he could not, of course, understand. He could only wonder and wait, for he felt intuitively that he mustn't speak. It was as though these strong men who had received him so generously into their lives put him now outside their circle, while they considered business of grave importance to themselves. "Well, boys," as the Dean, as if dismissing the subject, "I've been in this cow business a good many years now, and I've seen all kinds of men come and go, but I ain't never seen the man yet that could get ahead very far without paying for what he's got. Sometime, one way or another, whether he's so minded or not, a man just naturally's got to pay." "That law is not particular to the cattle business either, is it, Mr. Baldwin?" The words came from Patches. As they saw his face, it was their turn to wonder. The Dean looked straight into the dark eyes that were so filled with painful memories and wistful desire. "Sir?" "I mean," said Patches, embarrassed, as though he had spoken involuntarily, "that what you say applies to those who live idly and doing no useful work whatsoever, as well as to those who are dishonest in business of any kind, or who deliberately steal outright. Don't you say so?" The Dean, his eyes still fixed on the face of the new man, answered slowly, "I reckon that's so, Patches. When you come to think about it, it must be so. One way or another, every man that takes what he ain't earned has to pay for it." "Who's he?" asked the visitors of Curly and Bob as they went for their horses when the meal was over. The cross triangle men shook their heads. "He just blew in one day and the Dean hired him," said Bob. "But he's the handiest man with his fists that's ever been in this neck of the woods. If you don't believe it, you just go over there and start something," added Curly with enthusiasm. "Found it out, did you?" laughed Bert. "In something less than a minute," admitted Curly. "Kind of a funny name," mused Shorty. Bob grinned. That's what Curly thought at first. He had another think about it, did he? "Yep," agreed Curly. "He sure carries the proper credentials to make any name that he wants to wear good enough for me." The visitors mounted their horse and sat looking appraisingly at the tall figure of Honorable Patches as that gentleman passed them at a little distance on his way to the barn. "Could be you're right," admitted Shorty, "but he sure talks like a schoolmarm, don't he?" "He sure ain't no puncher," commented Bert. "No, but I'm gambling he's gonna be," retorted Curly, ignoring the references to Patch's culture. "Me too," agreed Bob. "Well, we'll all try him out on the fall rodeo. And better not let him drift far from the home ranch for a while," laughed the visitors. "So long." And then they were away. Before breakfast the next morning, Phil said to Patches, "Catch up Snip and give him some grain. You'll ride with me today." At Patch's look of surprise, he explained laughingly, "I'm gonna be giving my school a little vacation, and Uncle Will thinks it's time you was out of kindergarten." Later, as they were crossing the big pasture towards the country that lays to the south, the foreman volunteered the further information that for the next few weeks that they would ride the range. "May I ask what for?" said Patches, encouraged by the cowboy's manner. It was one of the man's peculiarities that he rarely entered into the talk of his new friends when their work was the topic of conversation, and he never asked questions except when alone with Phil or the dean, and then only when led on by them. It was not that he sought to hide his ignorance, for he made no pretense whatsoever, but his reticence rather the result of a curious feeling of shame that he had so little in common with these men whose lives were so filled with useful labor. And this, if he had known, was one of the things that made them like him. Men who lived in such close daily touch with the primitive realities of life, who thereby acquire a simple directness with a certain native modesty, have no place in their hearts for, to use their picturesque vocabulary, a four-flusher. Phil tactfully did not even smile at the question, but answered in a matter-of-fact tone. "We're looking out for screwworms. We'll brand a calf here and there, keep the waters hole open, look out for the stalking generally." "And you mean," questioned Patches doubtfully, "that I'm to ride with you?" "Sure. You see, Uncle Will thinks you're too good a man to waste on the odd jobs around the place, and so I'm going to get you in shape for the rodeo this fall." The effects of his words were peculiar. A deep red-colored Patch's face, and his eyes shone with bright gladness as he faced his companion. "And you? What do you think about it, Phil?" he demanded. The cowboy laughed at the man's eagerness. "Me? Oh, I think just as I have thought of all the time, ever since you asked for a job that day at the corral." Patches drew a deep breath and, sitting very straight in the saddle, looked away toward Granite Mountain, while Phil watched him curiously, felt something like kindly pity in his heart for this man who seemed so hungry for a man's work and a place among men. Just outside the deep-wash gate of the big pasture, a few cattle were grazing in the open flat. As the men rode towards them, Phil took down his rope while Patches watched him questioningly. "We might as well begin here," said the cowboy. "Do you see anything peculiar about that bunch?" Patches studied the cattle in vain. "What about that calf yonder?" suggested Phil leisurely, opening the loop of his rope. "I mean that 6-month youngster with the white face." Still Patches hesitated. Phil helped him again. "Take a look at his ears." "They're not marked," exclaimed Patches. "And what should they be marked?" asked the teacher. "Under bit right and a split left, if he belongs to the cross triangle," returned the pupil proudly, and in the same breath he exclaimed, "He's not branded either." Phil smiled approvingly. "That's right. We'll just fix him now before anyone else beats us to him." He moved his horse slowly towards the cattle as he spoke. "But," exclaimed Patches, "how do you know that he belongs to the cross triangle in the first place?" "He doesn't," returned Phil, laughing. "He belongs to me." "Well, I don't see how you can tell." "I know because I know the stock," Phil explained, "and because I remember that particular calf in the rodeo last spring. He got away from us with his mother in the cedars and brush over near the head of the mint wash. That's one thing you'll learn in this business, you see, but to be sure we're right, you watch him a minute now, and you'll see him go to a 5-bar cow. That 5-bar is my iron, you know. I have a few head running with Uncle Will's." As he spoke, the calf, frightened at their close approach, ran to a cow that was branded, just as Phil had said, and the cow, with an unmistakable maternal interest in her offspring, proved the ownership of the calf. "You see," said Phil, "we'll get that fella now, because before the next rodeo he'll be big enough to leave his mother, and then if he ain't branded he'll be a maverick, and then he'll belong to anyone who can put an iron on him." "But couldn't someone brand him now with their iron and then drive him away from his mother?" asked Patches. "Such things have been known to happen, and that not 1,000 miles from here either," returned Phil dryly. "But really, you know, Mr. Patches, it isn't done amongst the best people." Patches laughed aloud at his companion's attempt at a snippering affection. Then he watched with admiration while the cowboy set his horse after the calf, and too quickly for an inexperienced eye to see just how it happened, the deft riata stretched the animal by the heels. With a short hoggin rope, which he carried looped through a hole cut in the edge of his chaps near the belt, Phil tied the feet of his victim before the animal had recovered from the shock of the fall. And then, with Patches helping, proceeded to build a small fire of dry grass, sticks, and leaves with nearby brush. From his saddle, Phil took a small iron rod, flattened on one end, and only long enough to permit it being held in a gloved hand when the flattened end was hot. A running iron, he called it, and explained it to his interested pupil, as he thrust it in the fire, how some of the boys used an iron ring for range branding. "Is there no way to change or erase the brand?" asked Patches while the iron was hot. "Sure there is," replied Phil, and sitting on his heels cowboy fashion, he marked on the ground with a stick. "Look, this is the cross triangle brand, and this is the 4-bar M, happens to be Nick Cambert's iron, over on Tally Holt Mountain. Now, can't you see how, supposing if I was Nick, and this calf was branded with the cross triangle, I could work the iron over my brand?" Patches nodded. "But is there no way to detect such a fraud?" "It's a mighty hard thing to prove that an iron has been worked over," Phil answered shortly. "But the only sure way there is to catch the thief in the act." "But there's also the earmarks," said Patches a few moments later, when Phil was releasing the branded and marked calf. "The earmarks and the brand, they wouldn't agree." "They would if I was Nick," said Cowboy. Then he added quickly, as if regretting his remark, "Our earmark is a under bit right and a split left, you said. Well, the 4-bar M earmark is a crop and a under bit right and a swallow fork left." With the point of his iron now, he began again to mark in the dirt. Here's the cross triangle, and here is the 4-bar M. And if the calf branded with a tally-holt iron were to be followed after a cross triangle cow, then what? Came Patch's very natural question. Then, returned the foreman of the cross triangle grimly, there'd be a mighty good chance for trouble. It seems to me, said Patches as they rode on, that it'd be easily possible for a man to brand another man's calf by mistake. A man always makes a mistake when he puts his iron on another man's property, returned the cowboy shortly. But couldn't it be done innocently just the same? Persisted Patches. Yes, it might, admitted Phil. Well then, what would you do if you found a calf that you knew belonged to the Dean, branded with another man's iron? I mean, how would you proceed? Oh, I see what you're driving at, said Phil in quite a different tone. If you ever run on to a case, the first thing you do is be dead sure that the misbranded calf belongs to one of our cows. Then, if you're right, and it's not too far, you drive the cow and calf into the nearest corral and report it. If you can't get them to a corral without too much trouble, just put the cross triangle on the calf's ribs. When he shows up at the next rodeo with the right brand on his ribs, and some other brand where the right brand ought to be, you'll take pains to remember his natural markings, of course. You'll explain the circumstances, and the owner of the iron that put on him by mistake will be asked to vent his brand. A brand is vented by putting the same brand on the animal's shoulder. Look, there's one over there now. He pointed to an animal a short distance away. See, that steer is branded 1.5 on the hip and shoulder and a cross triangle on his ribs. Well, when he was a yearling, he belonged to a 1.5 outfit. We picked him up in the rodeo, away over towards Mud Tanks. He was running with our stock, and Stillwell didn't want to go to the trouble of taking him home. About 30 miles it was, so we sold him to Uncle Will, and then he vented his brand, as you can see. I see, said Patches. But that's different from finding a calf that's misbranded. Sure, there was no question of ownership there, agreed Phil. But in the case of the calf, the cowboy's pupil persisted. If it had left its mother when the man owning the iron was asked to vent it, there'd be no way to proving the real ownership. Nothing but the word of the man who found the calf with his mother, and perhaps the knowledge of the men who knew the stock. What I'm getting at, smiled Patches, is this. It would come down at last to the question of men, wouldn't it? That's where most things come to in the end in this country, Patches. But you're right. With owners like Uncle Will, Jim Reed, and Stillwell, and dozens of others, and with cowboys like Curly, Bob, and Bert, and Shorty, there'd be no trouble at all about the matter. But with others? Suggested Patches. Well, said Phil slowly, there are men in this country who, if they refused to vent a brand under such circumstances, would be seeing trouble, and mighty quick, too. There's another thing that we got to watch out for just now, continued Phil a few minutes later, and that's sleepers. We'll suppose, he explained, that I want to build up my bunch of 5-bar, and that I'm not too particular about how I do it. Well, I run on to an unbranded Pothook-esque calf that looks good to me, but I don't dare put my iron on him because he's too young to leave his mother. If I let him go until he's older, some of Jim Reed's riders will brand him, and you see, I never could work over the Pothook-esque iron with my 5-bar. So I earmark the calf with the owner's marks and don't brand him at all. Then he's a sleeper. If the Pothook-esque boys see him, they'll notice he's earmarked all right, and very likely they'll take it for granted that he's branded, or perhaps let him go anyway. Before the next rodeo, I run on to my sleeper again, and he's big enough now to take away from the cow. So all I have to do is change the earmarks and brand him with my iron. Of course, I wouldn't get all my sleepers, but the percentage would certainly be in my favor. If too many sleepers show up at the rodeo, though, folks would be getting mighty suspicious that someone's been too handy with his knife. We had a lot of sleepers at the last rodeo, he concluded quietly. In Patches, remembering what little Billy had said about Nick Cambert and Yockapee Joe, and with the talk of the visiting cowboys still fresh in his mind, realized that he was making some progress in his education. Riding leisurely, and turning frequently aside for a nearer view of the cattle they sighted here and there, they reached Tally-Ho a little before noon. Here in a rocky hollow of the hills, a small stream wells from under the granite walls, only to lose itself a few hundred yards away in the sand and gravel of the wash. But, short as its run is in the daylight, the water never fails, and many cattle come from the open range that lay on every side to drink, and in the summertime to spend the heat of the day standing in the cool and wet sands, or laying in the shade of the giant sycamores that line the bank of the opposite of the bluff. There are corrals nearby, and a rude cook shack under the widening spread of branches of an old walnut tree, and the ground of the flat open space, a little back from the water, is beaten bare and hard by the thousands upon thousands of cattle that at many a past rodeo time have been gathered there. The two men found, as the diamond and a half riders had said, several animals suffering from those pests in the Arizona ranges, the screwworm. As Phil explained to Patches while they watered their horses, the screwworm is the larva of a blowfly that breeds in sores of living animals. The unhealed wounds of the branding iron make the calves by far the most numerous among the sufferers, and were the most affected animals not treated, the loss during the season would be amount to the considerable. "Look here, Patches," said the cowboy, as his practiced eyes noted the number needing attention. "I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll just run this hospital bunch into the corral, and you can limber up that rope of yours." And so Patches learned not only the unpleasant work of cleaning the worm-infested sores with coliform, but also received his first lesson in the use of the cowboy's indispensable tool, the riata. End of part 1 of 2.